Joe Mullings from 160 Studios, and I am joined from around the globe over in Europe. Steve Bell, thank you for taking time this evening on yours time.
Good to see you, Joe.
Tom, up in Beantown, keeping it nice and steady and real for us. And I appreciate both you gentlemen stepping in right now. And Tom, I'm going to be looking for you to shepherd this in on first half of the year, 2024, soft tissue surgical robotics.
No, absolutely no. I mean, obviously, I'm the question guy. You guys are the info and insight department. So I'll just continue to make withdrawals throughout this conversation. So we really enjoyed the conversation we had down in your neck of the woods in Florida. I know a couple hours away. I think a lot of people really appreciated the holistic view of where surgical robotics is, and it's something I don't think has been done quite like that. So we kind of want to build on that, I think, and take a look at the sector maybe every 6 months or so. We'll have a conversation now, and hopefully we'll do this again in December, because I'm anticipating we'll have another busy second half or a busy second half of 2024. So let's just kick it off. We're going to probably go over, I don't know, let's go with 10. 10's always a good number of things we saw happening in the first half of this year. And when I was making this list, I'm like, I'll never get to 10, but I had to stop. I mean, there's just so much going on. And Steve, I mean, just overall, maybe it's just a matter of my paying attention more closely than I have in the past, but this has been kind of a crazy 6 months, hasn't it, for surgical robotics?
Yeah, it's been incredible. I mean, it's kind of like buses. You wait for a long time for one to come along, and then they all come along at once. So, we saw all the robots stacked up at SRS, but not just that, just how many are coming out, in the reports, how many are in the works. And I think it's just it's a phenomenally good time in surgical robotics, but healthcare robotics, where there's just a lot of enthusiasm. How long this can last for and how much this momentum keeps going is a different question. But at the minute, I think we're hitting kind of like a peak at the minute. And I think it's just a really exciting time in this space.
And Joe, how about from your perspective? You've been talking with a lot of these companies. We've been talking about surgical robotics for over a year now, you and I, in different conversations. And again, it just seems to be getting more and more interesting out there.
Yeah, I like Steve's sort of analogy with the bus. You wait along and they'll all come at once. The problem there, it becomes a bottleneck, and there's only so many acquirers of those organizations as they come to the front of the line and finally get through FDA. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, Tom, if we start going back to 15, 18 years ago and we start getting acquisitions before FDA clearance, because that waiting period may be entirely too long. And candidly, from the time you acquire something and you've got that team built already, and you get that minimally viable product out and that surprise and delight with your first 8 customers, that could be a 2-year period. And I don't know if these large strategics have the time to wait on the sidelines for that. So I think we're in the golden age of robotics. I said that about this time last year. And I think it'll prove out over the next 2 or 3 years.
Fantastic. Well, let's just start working our way down the list. I think it would be unwise, I think, to just to bury Da Vinci 5 in the list, because people are going to know it's coming. So let's just get it out of the way first and foremost. So I was just thinking back to, I think it was January, when there was sort of rumors that, oh, is there going to be a new version of Da Vinci coming out? Oh, is it coming? Speculation, analysts wondering, and then boom, it came out, and then 2 or 3 months later, boom, it went through the FDA. Steve, talk about the seismic impact that DV5 has sort of had on the sector, because there's been a lot of reverberation.
Yeah, I think what they've done, which I think is one of the big game changers, is they didn't veer too far. They didn't get sucked into the hype of the modulars and the opens, and they didn't go away from the XI architecture. And I think that in history, in 10 years' time, will be something that we all say was one of the smartest moves ever. Because what it allowed them to go through FDA and get more or less the same procedures and the same coverage that they get today with the XI, which just gives them a huge leap forward, a new generation robot, but with all the same access they get with the XI. I mean, nobody else can do that. So I think that that's the one thing we will look back at of how they went through that launch and say that, that was really clever, and it gave them that edge in the first 2 or 3 years of launch that consolidated their base. And I think that's going to be so important for them.
And Joe, let's talk about the impact on the market. You had said that it, really kind of reset the tone. I feel like it was a team leading by 10 in a basketball game, and they hit a 3-pointer to kind of, just further lead a bit, and just kind of to put a little bit of damper on the spirit of the competition. What is this the impact of DV5 been on the marketplace?
I think we're yet to see it. As Steve brings up a good point, is the sort of subtle rollout of this from a feature perspective. There was no need for them to rush anything heavy here because there's nobody chasing them right now. So what they're doing, though, and I'm going to continue to use this because the visual is just going to be so viscerally correct over the next couple of years. Intuitive just continues to just pull organizations to the deep end of the pool and just allows them to blow through resources that are purely driven by ego and poor decisions made over a decade ago. So there's no need for them to rush. This is going to be a nice, slow, continued win with Da Vinci. And they have a lot of other things going on. Tom, look, they're converting over to leases now. So that's a little complexity right there. Mm-hmm. They're spending a lot of time on driving their supply chain to more self-contained. So they're becoming, in a positive way, an isolationist. And if you talk to the contract manufacturers, they're starting to see Intuitive now start pull things in-house that historically they had externally on the manufacturing side of things, whether it's stapling, whether it's certain injection molded metal devices. And that may kick back on them a little bit from a cost perspective because they were getting some sweetheart deals on some of these contract manufacturing relationships because of the volumes. But if they start pulling all that in-house now, some of that may change a little bit. But before the show, I ran some quick numbers. Since the same quarter 22 to Q1 24, their system install base is up 27% in 2 years. Over the same period, their instrument and accessory is up 40% over 2 years. I mean, these are crazy numbers. And service revenue up 25%. Operating lease revenue up 70%, 70%. Obviously, starting from a much lower number, and that's been a trend. And system revenue is actually down because it would be down because system lease revenue is up. So, these numbers, they're increasing their install base and they're increasing their usage on each of the machines, which is just going to be setting the table for the Da Vinci 5 to roll in with even less friction and inertia coming to market.
All right. I think we'll unpack the comments about others' egos a little bit later in the podcast when we kind of review the market at large. But I've been surprised by the sort of the rise of miniature robots, smaller robots like Mira. Microbot had some good news from the FDA. Steve, what is this? These obviously been under development for a long time. They're not popping out of the ground like a sprout. But what does the arrival of these robots mean for the sector?
So I think this is part of something that myself and Joe talked about a little bit, which is we're going to start seeing a better segmentation. There's not just going to be like 30 Da Vincis. People are going to have to start taking on Da Vinci in different, smarter ways. And part of that, for example, is if you look at things like the Mira robot, that is definitely not a Da Vinci. Now, can it do some of the things that Da Vinci does? Yes. But will it have a really specific place in the acuity of procedures, the site of care, the entire way that workflow happens? That thing comes ready, sterile, out of a box. Okay? The whole robot's in the box. It's pretty amazing. that kind of innovative thinking and that kind of way of trying to go around the edge of intuitive is smart. And you're going to see more and more of people realizing, hey, running into that brick wall is quite painful. Let's try and go around the edges and go and try and nip at the edges and still have a great business. I mean, if Mira could just get, a small fraction of the total surgeries that are done in the US in ASCs, that's a great business to have. So I think we're going to see more and more of these systems, A, popping up, and B, having success, because I think they're not going to be running into that wall of intuitive.
Joe, I think this kind of builds into something you've been talking about on LinkedIn a lot, sort of the power of incremental advances rather than kind of trying to get the whole big robotic system at once, just moving forward and kind of building a robotic portfolio. speak, I guess, about Mira and Microbot, but we can kind of bleed into topic number 3, which is Moon and some of the other smaller robotic systems out there. Where is this? Let's wrap 2 and 3 together. Talk about the movement toward the smaller robot.
Yeah, so we're going to see the movement towards a smaller robot, and then you're going to start to have the discussion over cold beers is what defines a robot. Because, you know, is Microbot a robot? Well, depends on your definition of the robot. Is Moon a robot? Depends on your definition of the robot. The more that we see the market turned towards, you know, its early days, I'm actually looking at a Moon, and I think it's an advantage of a Moon not to be included in the soft tissue robot category. Because it's an unfair comparator on the number of things that it does. And so what you're doing now is you're going to take LAP 1.0 and let's call Moon LAP 2.0. Now, is there a computer integrated into that between the surgeon and the patient and the apparatus? 100%. And this is where I come back to what's your definition of a robot? Is a small catheter driven by a joystick inside, you know, a vasculature a robot? Yes. So I think you're going to start to look for new language in the areas, because until now, if you said surgical robot, open the dictionary, you had Da Vinci there. And so what we're going to start to care is less about general surgery, multi-use robots like Da Vinci, and you're going to start to find $5,000, $10,000 robotic systems that are going to do one single procedure. And you can accelerate those, especially with the FDA, and I know we're going to talk about that, through the FDA process very quickly. And then you're going to have a large number of companies that can now acquire these robotic platforms, whereas you only have 2 or 3 right now in the large format soft tissue. So that's where, those are my thoughts on, you know, when I think about a Moon, I still want to call Moon a computer-assisted surgical platform in a LAP 2.0 environment, but I wouldn't put it in the same category as the distal motion. I wouldn't put it in the same category as the Da Vinci. I think it's a brand new category, and we're going to start to see that.
Interesting. So, Steve, is this just the natural development of technology development? You start big and get smaller, and I know the functionality is different and the functions and the purposes are different, but is this just feel like the way that technology development and medical device development in particular works? You start at one size and you get better and you get smaller and you get more focused?
I think one of the learnings that people have had over the last 10 years is that to do the big multi-arm robots is very complex and very, very expensive. And you can actually deliver a lot of the value of what you get in those systems. So stable 3D vision, wristed instruments, spare arms so that you can have less bedside people. Different aspects of it can be delivered in a simplified format. And that does 2 or 3 things, exactly what Joe was saying. It, you know, it takes it into a different category. But what it actually does is it also helps you as a company not have to spend the same amount of money to get to still a good result and take a large section of either the market or a newer market. Like I think LAP 2.0 will be a slightly newer market. So what I think it does is it takes off some of the burden of the company. So if you're not having to make, in Moon's case, also a console and also a tower, I mean, you're down to and I'm sure that Anne would be really upset with me if I said it's a third of the development that you have to do a Moon. She's, you know, her engineers would be killing me if they were here. But what the reality is that you don't have to spend such volumes of money, time, effort, resources, and you don't have to do the whole gambit of visualization, reverse kinematics, haptics, all of that. You get to, I wouldn't say have an easier ride, because nothing's easy in this space, but it's way easier to do than building an entire Da Vinci competitor.
Yeah, and if you take the Pareto principle on that alone, the 80-20 principle, right? When you think about these surgical robotics, Steve's absolutely, you know, spot on there. Is this close enough to doing what we want to get done? And then the really driving factor is, we've always got to come back to this, is just follow the money. Development of robotics or digitally assisted surgery or interventional procedures is going to come back to what is the reimbursement on that procedure. you can develop all the robots you want until you can match up reimbursement, developmental costs, field support, and then the ability to afford the system. What is the reimbursement principle in the US right now? Rest of world's a little bit of a dynamic. So I believe that's going to drive us to a lower cost, disposable robot category, digitally assisted surgery category, surgical robotic category. You're going to start to see these emerge.
Now, how much of this is being driven by the rise of ASCs?
Steve, you want to take that one first?
Yeah. So again, there's a huge push for. There's a lot of procedures went from the ASCs to the main block because they wanted to be able to say they were doing it on a robot, and it didn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a sense from a workflow point of view, from an acuity point of view, and definitely not from a reimbursement point of view. Some of those procedures should have stayed over in the ASC. And as more and more hospitals buy up the ASCs and they get them into their own networks, then they are going to sort of politically within inside say, okay, well, which procedures need to go back to the ASC? And there'll be a fight, right? The surgeons say, well, I really want to do this robotic. And maybe that midpoint that people will get to is, well, all right, look, you want to do it sort of robotic, let's say sort of robotic. How about if you do it with a digital lap? So you still can sort of market it that way, but it makes now sense at the ASC. So I think you'll come to this happy medium ground where some of these technologies will allow the administration and the surgeons to come to a happy medium and bring a lot of those procedures back over to the ASCs.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the reimbursement's always going to be a challenge. So again, Joe's absolutely right. You know, the ultimate cap on it is going to be, do we make money on this in the US? And if you don't make money on it, there are some procedures where I did have some ASC managers say to me about 2 years ago, they were happy to take a bath on a couple of procedures if it meant that the majority of procedures came back where they made the profit on. So it's not exactly black and white. But I do think that there's going to be a huge push to try and get what should be done in the ASC, which is sensible to be done in the ASC and can make profit in the ASC on a platform that allows that to happen financially, technologically, size-wise. I think there will be that push back to the ASCs probably in the coming 5 years.
Interesting.
The ASC side,
Joe?
Tom, so I have a couple thoughts on that thinking really forward. I think you got to look at the ASC market as a consumer magnet market, where currently if you go to the hospital, I'm going down the block to Jupiter Medical Center, and by default, people in my demographic 60 plus is like, I'm going to the hospital, I'm good. But you're going to start seeing ASCs become incredibly savvy, and they have to, in their marketing and advertising to the consumer, who ultimately ends up being the patient eventually. And so Steve just used the term digital lap. Like, that is like saying, I'm going to get a partial knee done. No, I'm going to get a makoplasty, right? So I think you're going to start to see this real consumer-driven sensitivity coming out of the ASCs with a lot more sophistication, and that's an entire new business category that's going to come out. You're going to start to see these companies coming out driving efficiencies in the ASCs, where their efficiencies in a hospital not nearly as golden as they are in the ASCs. So when you look at whatever technology you bring into the ASC, it's got to dramatically increase efficiency. It's got to serve the middle of the curve. And there's got to be some pull-through follow-up technologies or procedures from those main drivers. And then you're going to start to see business people who may have run car dealerships coming in running these ASCs. Because if you run them like a healthcare system, it's going to get crushed, because the mindset of the healthcare veteran will not work in the ASC model, and therefore it won't become successful.
And you mentioned the private equity players in our previous conversation as well. They know how to run a business for sure. And just a small sample size for me, I've had 2 relatives who have required or considered medical procedures, and I was surprised in both conversations. Robotics was a big part of their discussion. It's here. I mean, it's not something that the 3 of us are talking about only anymore. It's part of the patient zeitgeist, I guess. All right, let's move on to the meeting that kind of brought us all together the first time. SRS, it was my first time there. Joe, you had told me about it and encouraged me to come down, and I'm grateful for that. Joe, talk about the I would say emerging power of SRS, but it's merging for me because I went for the first time. You've been going, but the power of SRS as a meeting, it really it was a unique gathering, and I got so much out of it, not only from the content, but also from the meetings and then from the conversations after that. So what an event. Amazing.
Yeah, I think we chatted about it down there when the three of us were
Yep.
wrapping up the show, but it's still the show, I believe, that has the truest meritocracy in med device today, because it's not run by the large strategics. You go to any other show and you've got J&J, Abbott, Medtronic, right, Boston Sci, whether it's TCT, AHA, ACS, you can go across the board. But at the SRS show, it's a pure meritocracy. Put it Intuitive aside, and they've earned that spot. But you didn't see them as a giant there. They certainly were dominant. But you had other companies that have just 5, 6, 7 years old getting as much attention
Yep.
as anybody else. And actually, none of the large strategics, were there. J&J,
Yep.
Medtronic apparently was behind closed doors. I mean, it was really interesting. So that's why I love that show. And I don't think that's going to change much. I think that will continue to be, for the very, very sort of, I wouldn't say near-term future, you earned it, you're up front, you didn't buy your way to the front of the line, because you've got this juggernaut bundling capability of every other sort of therapeutic approach to surgery is going to be dominated by the large strategics. Because culturally, a single-use disposable or reusable that is not a digitally native platform is easy for those strategics to put into their playbook. What makes SRS interesting is it's a digital surgery play that is not a native skill to any of the strategics today.
And we're talking soft tissue in this conversation. J&J did actually have the big booth there, but they had Monarch there, and they had Velis, so they had their other surgical robotic systems there. And I think Medtronic was around the corner, but they didn't have any sort of system there at all. And I wasn't aware of something behind closed doors. Steve, what was your takeaway of the meeting at all? And if you want to add anything to Joe's comments about who was there and who wasn't, feel free.
Yeah, so my general sense of why I like that meeting as well is that it's not a pure clinical meeting. A lot of these meetings become very pure clinical.
Yeah.
This talked a lot about innovation that was happening. They had the whole thing on telemedicine, but it was not just, some case reports of what we did in a telemedicine case. It was the whole infrastructure around it. And I think VIP's done a really, really good job of getting that balance right between industry, investors, community. Even the FDA were there, which we'll probably talk a little bit about. I love the way that it's a balance between technology, industry, clinical. That whole balance to me is fairly unique in that meeting. Yes, in some of the big meetings, you have 90% clinical, and then you get company slot, which this is different. This meeting it's a genuine mixed bag across everything. And I think that's where you get the real interaction, because you learn a lot from the clinical, but the clinical also learn a lot from the companies, learn a lot from the investor side. I just think it's a fabulous meeting for that reason.
One quick question, Steve. My favorite part of that SRS meeting is the investor day. I mean, by far, because you learn where the wins are, the perceived wins, the wins of change. I wonder, let's just throw this out on the table here. If Intuitive was not in the robotic world, would there be any reason for the investor day? I mean, what other company there is a publicly traded company and would venture even show up to talk about their investment in robots? If you pulled Intuitive out of that meeting, I mean, it's sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room that everybody is talking about. So again, it comes back to when they, breathe, the entire industry moves, including Wall Street. And listen, tomorrow, I mean, what's today, the 16th, whatever it is, 17th? They've got June 18th tomorrow. I think they've got first half numbers coming out. That'll be really interesting to see. And that'll give us more insight into Da Vinci 5 as well as their success. So I think SRS, VIP does it really well. And I bring that investor up because I don't know many other meetings that have an investor day in them in any other meeting in the US. So I think that's really interesting.
So look, to answer your question on that, I think that it was very interesting to watch this year, and the Investor Days was predominantly so Intuitive got up there and spoke candidly, and they actually spoke on reality, and they sort of really talked about what they had. I think what was disappointing for me was that the other strategics, except for Kevin Lobos, which I think was a good talk. Kevin's talk was really, really good and honest, and we are going to look at it, but we're not going to go head to head. But if you look at the other strategics, should they have even been on the stage? I mean, that for me just felt like a little bit flat. I found it more exciting to see, and I think the investors found it more exciting to see what's happening with the other companies around the world. I think one of the things that I got feedback from some of the investors was they were surprised at how many international robots were there, both out of Europe and out of China, especially. And a lot of the technologies that were emerging, they really hadn't had on their radar screen before. So I think it was also good from that point of view that some of the smaller companies, the innovative companies, some of the imaging companies, some of the data companies had a chance to show their wares in front of the investors. But at the Wall Street tickets, there was Intuitive and
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a population of one for sure at this point.
And it's tough for the J&Js and the Medtronics to sit on those panels because it's just circle talk. It's the same talk track. Tom, I've said it before. You did a yeoman's job last year at Device Talks West Coast trying to get anything for 45 minutes. That, and you're probably one of the best interviewers in medtech. And even you took your gloves off a little bit and you still couldn't shake it. So, what can you talk about in the market if you don't have anything in the market? So, first of all, great for VIP, coming back to the SRS, great for VIP for having an investor morning. And I think it is the part of the show that is the favorite part for anybody in that category.
Great stuff. Well, let's keep building on the OUS robotics that we saw. My eyes were opened as well, and I know Steve, you opened the meeting there, and we don't need to revisit all that, but you had your presentation, which we actually presented also a couple of weeks ago on Device Talks Tuesdays. But just the robotic surgical systems that are emerging in India, in China, as you mentioned, in Europe. If you want to kind of give us an overview of that population, feel free. But I'd love to get from the both of you, what is the long-term impact of these robotic surgical systems? Do they find their way to the U.S.? I know we talked a bit about that in the earlier meeting. Do they just sort of make things more challenging OUS for the three companies that we talk about primarily? But Steve, give us a sense of what we're seeing emerge outside of the U.S.
Yeah, so as you say, the systems coming out of Japan, India, China. There's some out of Korea as well, but there's a lot out of Europe. So you've got some out of Spain, like Bitrack with Rob Surgical. You've got the UK, right. CMR Surgical and Versius, Dex Distal Motion and Moon. So they're all coming out. So I think they all look at the US market and say, we've got to work that out somehow. Okay. But I think what they have to do first is consolidate in their own markets first and prove out their thesis in their own markets. So the Chinese robots were very interesting. So you had Tumai by Microport, you had Kangduo by SageBot there, and they were showing that they are getting some success in those markets, and they were showing some of their technical prowess as well with things like the 5G telesurgery that were showing, distance surgery that they were showing. So I think that they're starting to demonstrate that they can get some traction in segments of the market within their own countries, which they should do rightly. I mean, again, if you've got a Japanese robot like Hinatori from Medicoroid and you can't do well in Japan, then you're not going to have any success outside of Japan. So I think they're going to demonstrate locally first. But to your question, they must all have their eye on the prize. And this may be the thing that kills a lot of them, by the way, is if they become over-focused of trying to get into the US, which is a pretty saturated market, it's the home turf of Intuitive. There's already 1.7 robots per hospital in the US on average. That's a really tough one to crack, but it'll be too tempting for everybody because they'll look at the US and say, that's where the money is. That's where the growth is. I think that's the danger that they all have, and they'll all want to do it. How they work out how to get into the US is going to be the thing that's going to be interesting over the next 3 to 5 years.
Joe, I mean, to build on that if you'd like to, but I'm also curious as to OUS markets. I think to your analogy you offered a few times of fighting the UFC fighter in the phone booth, go go to a place where you can win. And I think OUS had been seen as a place where someone other than Intuitive might be able to build a business. How does the rise of these robots, do you think, impact that opportunity for a Medtronic or a J&J?
Well, I think you're going to have a nationalistic approach and influence, at least, maybe not an absolute overwhelming advantage, but CMR in the UK, SS Innovation in India, Renovo and China, right? So here's the issue there. That good enough is good enough there, and as Steve said, you can get away with that because the cost per robot is substantially lower than Intuitive. And you're always going to have a mixed blend of robots there. But what concerns me is the following. On these robots that are going to soft tissue, they're going to try any robot. So let's just take it away from soft tissue for a second. Here's what I have seen happen. Anytime I have built an OUS company that comes to the US, and I've probably built more than 300 companies that have taken a technology out of their native country and brought it to the US. Here's what they all do incorrectly, and a majority of them put themselves out of business because of these decisions. The habits that they had embedded in the development process on workflow, usage, clinical interface is not taken into consideration in the US. So when you come to the US, and if you don't deploy a US-based team, if you don't deploy the right US-based team who understand the care pathways here, the reimbursement, how to interact with the clinicians, and then if you try and hire them yourself, and this is not an advertisement for headhunters, I have watched time and time again a company out of even the UK, out of Germany, out of France, out of Spain, come to the US and hire Sally or Fred. And Sally or Fred at best are mid-market competitors. They're not the best of the best, but they need a job and they're available. And they take advantage of these OUS companies who don't know how to vet these people out properly. And then they give them a spending budget to try and go commercial or set up go-to-market for a year, and they ruin the reputation, they don't get the penetration they need, and they end up strangling themselves. So these now we have the complexity of a surgical robot, and I'm building 2 commercial teams right now of OUS companies that are coming to the US with, I think, best in class in both their different categories. Finding the people who are clinically going to be your shepherds in order to put those robots in the hands in the teaching institutions and these universities that you have to put them in the hands of, Asante or a VIP or somebody like that. There are less than 2 dozen to 3 dozen in the entire country that I would say are A players that you can afford and make sense and are available. And after these 2 companies come to the US and put together their initial squad, I'm going to tell you, after talking to hundreds of people out there, that anybody who follows them is going to have a very difficult time finding a best-in-class player. And Steve, I know even CMR was preemptive in that hiring here in the US when you were going to come in, and you had some solid people there. There was 1 or 2 really good people, and then there were some solid people. And again, because there's no experience in that market unless you work for Intuitive, and that's my point. You either came out of the lap business, the scope business, or something, but you never really moved a robot through. So I'm not saying somebody can't get there, but there's a very small pool of people. And if you're an OUS robot, once you get here, the salaries absolutely devastate your plan that you put together 4 years ago. To get a decent clinical person here is $160,000 to $180,000. That's probably what the CEO is making in India. So you've got all these other things working against you that unless you're really behind the lines here, you don't know what you're going to face. And I'm telling you, a lot of OUS companies have no clue and underclub that.
Interesting. No, I don't know which 2 companies you're talking about, but I'm thinking Distal Motion, based in Switzerland, but they have Greg Roach as the CEO, so who is at Zimmer Biomet, head of their robotics. So that's bringing in some insights. Bertina Hume from Quantum Surgical relocated to Miami. Should we be keeping an eye on these companies as sort of a way to do it, or whether or not this model can be successful of moving into the US?
I think it's your pricing model too. You know, I think
Yeah.
Quantum's hitting some headwinds because they're not going to go through a leasing model, and they're trying to go through the same ortho model they had with their previous success. You know, Distal Motion is taking its time, as it should be. You know, great leadership there with Greg and Chris and Michael back in Switzerland. You know, so they're being very, very patient. The same thing, you know, with Ann and Jeff and the team there being very, very patient. But companies like that are gobbling up all the clinical people. And when you want to come in now and you want to set up pre-FDA, your relationships and your machines and your training and solicitation to KOLs, if you don't have that crack team giving that white glove service, you're never even going to make it here. And I don't think that is appreciated enough in that area.
Interesting. Well, let's get into the FDA. So I was surprised by the speed upon which DV5 was approved, and I'm nobody. I don't really follow this industry. I thought that whenever you get in front of the FDA, it's going to take several months, and this took maybe 2. Steve, I mean, you were at SRS. The FDA was there, gave its presentation. We've seen a few different approvals coming through with DV5 and Moon Surgical, and a few others are stepping forth. What is the FDA? How are you assessing the FDA's feelings towards surgical robotics? And does it feel like maybe they're not giving a green light, but it certainly is a blinking yellow light, and it's encouraging people to move forward cautiously?
Yeah, so I think Intuitive did a great job of making it feel like it was a 2-month approval, because that's probably been going on for about 2.5 years, probably more than
Great
that.
point. They got me. They got me.
But they got everyone right. And by the way, very few companies can do what they did. They've got an enormous amount of employees, and nobody was loose-lipped on DV5. They managed to basically keep it until it was launched. 99% of it was unknown, right? That is just brilliance. And it will have been the same on the FDA, because they will have done, they did it. Well, I know they did a lot of studies in between, because the force feedback studies were done. They did IDE studies. So they've kept it really under wraps. And they know what it takes to get a robot through FDA. They are the originals and the masters, and they've taken several through. They've taken the X, they've taken the SP, they've taken the Ion. So they know how to get robots through. And it is a long, arduous process. And especially they've been doing this through the whole flux of, is it a 510K? Is it a de novo? Is it a 510K? Is it a de novo? You know, that whole flux was in there as well. So they've done just a really, really good job on that. My sensation is that there's kind of a big flux going on with FDA and CE MDR. So in the past, MDD made it out, I don't want to say easy, but what they were looking for in MDD was, you know, can you make this thing and make the thing safely? Not, you know, what does the performance of it look like, and can you prove that it's safe out in the wild? Instead, with the MDR change and the whole mess, the way that I feel that was done, it was just a complete mess up the way it was done. I think the MDR is the right thing, but it's just the way it was done was not handled very well. It's now made it that Europe is one of the most difficult places to get a robot in, and you're seeing that now with a lot of companies who you thought would have easily got CE mark, you know, are still there. You know, Hinatori is, I think, now 2.5, 3 years for MDR, whereas FDA, I think, went through this whole, are they the same? Are they not the same? All right, well, we're going to make it a de novo. Okay. And that then meant that there was a lot of then backpedaling and having to do different things for a lot of companies, and a lot of gnashing of teeth I heard over the few years that was in as well. But I think FDA's got its act together. And my understanding is now that for the de novo, they are going to commit to the timelines of the de novo, which is very impressive. And then at SRS, they came and talked, and they sort of lifted the hood a little bit on a few things. And one of them was that they were looking at putting robots into different classes, so that if you're in the same class and you can sort of prove your safety profile, prove you're close enough, prove that your smell, touch, and feel is close enough to one of the already approved robots, you could get a 510K. So the FDA is trying really hard, because they want competition, right? For the American population, the FDA, they want to have the best for the American patients. So I think they are aligned to that. And Benita, who was there, I think they showed that they are trying to help the community to get them through. And I think it was just a little bit messy for a while. I think they've cleaned that up. Intuitive, though, got that through well, got it through quietly. And now you are seeing other robots coming through. So MMI in the first half of this year also got approved. So that's another category that got approved. You had Microbot that got the approval. I'll say clearance. Clearance is probably a better word than approval. So I think there's going to be a raft of them coming through, and you might even see a few now Da Vinci clones even go faster because of the 510K route. But I'm very optimistic actually that you will see more and more robots get through the regulatory process. I'm less optimistic that then they'll make a commercial success of it. But I expect Medtronic by the end of the year to have a clearance of some form on Hugo. But it's taken them probably 2 years as well. So,
Joe, let's talk a bit about you were sitting in the FDA session at SRS as well, but you also follow the market more broadly. I mean, what is this attitude and approach by the FDA? What impact does that have on the market as a whole? It's definitely fuel to the fire.
Look, I mean, Intuitive wrote the book that the FDA drafted off of, right? Because they learned through it. And Intuitive's got so much gravitas with the FDA as a teacher. And you heard that a number of times during the FDA session, is they're there to teach, right? And facilitate, not accelerate unfairly on anybody, but to give you the playbook that they're going to be looking for. And that playbook's become more and more defined. And I think it's going to become even further defined if we start to have the stratification of robots in categories that they said, if it looks like and rhymes with, then you can make it through the FDA. I'm really interested to see, as Steve alluded to, is how many organizations are going to come to the US, go through the FDA, and still know in the back of their mind they don't have a buyer, because all you're going to do is burn through money that way. So clearance is different than adoption and ongoing utilization. And then standing up that system in the US without one of the big strategics makes zero sense in any business model. So I don't know if we're going to see as many systems come to the US as we expect that are standing up and saying they're going to, because you've got to have half a billion plus just to go commercial in the US, to go commercial. So why would you start going down that road with the FDA if you do not have the dry powder in place already? So that's my thought on it. I think the FDA is clearing the way. The FDA knows that digitally assisted or robotic assisted surgery is the future. They're putting more headcount into that part of the agency. They're putting clear guidelines in. There's less guessing. They won't suffer fools, because this is all romantically wonderful. But the second that a robot in the US malfunctions at the cost of a patient's life, I think you're going to, and it's just a matter of time before it happens. It's not going to be incompetency. It's just doing statistically the numbers. And it could be operator error for all that, you know. I think that will put a pause on, you know, the rapid approval or clearance of systems in the US, unfortunately.
No, that's a good point. Steve?
I was going to just add on there. I think some smaller companies will want to get a clearance badge. And if they're smart, they'll get the clearance badge, but then not go and try and do the whole commercial uptake. And the reason that you could do that is that there are many strategics that will want that badge. They'll want that checkbox done on the system before they think to purchase it, because they'll want access to the US market. They've got a US very centric based company. So I think they could take that as a quality mark or a check mark or a tick mark. And then if they're sensible, because Joe's right, you know, you're gonna need a lot of money and a lot of willpower to actually commercialize in the US. So you can just get the clearance and then sit and hold. You're not forced to commercialize, by the way. Nobody says you've got FDA clearance, you now have to sell. There's nothing in the rule book that says that. And I think if anyone wants to be smart about this, they'll get the clearance and then see if then they can entice a strategic to help them then with commercialization, either through a partnership or through an acquisition in the US.
Well, let's continue with this. I want to get into some technologies a little later, but we're kind of hitting upon the competitive landscape for larger OEMs. We've talked a bit about Medtronic already. Your expectation that they'll have some sort of clearance by the end of the year. What is this? What do the next couple of years look like for the landscape for surgical robotics? And I don't know whether to ask this within this or not because it's relevant. That the movement in digital surgery. J&J had a release at SRS about their new platform. Medtronic announced this week their abilities with I don't want to say telesurgery, but their touch surgery platform. They actually demonstrated at Device Talks Boston their ability to sort of encourage cooperation across oceans. I'm really mangling this question, so let's focus first of all on the competitive landscape. How do things develop? And within that, let's talk about the importance that a digital surgery platform will play within that, because I think that's going to be key going forward.
You know,
Okay.
go ahead,
Sorry,
Steve.
go ahead, Joe. No,
Yeah,
go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
So you know, the polyphonic mention at SRS was interesting, and just like Medtronic this past week had that announcement, they've got to keep their name in the game, right? So you can keep talking about these releases and these platforms. I mean, we had somebody reach out to us on an anonymous email reminding us that J&J did have a visualization stack in pure view, even though it's on the ortho side, and you know it's going to go onto the Ottava system. And I think that if we're going to look at the landscape, Medtronic is going to continue to have major challenges. If you listen to what's going on in Europe, you got stabilization issues with the robot. That's going to permeate whatever country it's in. You've got supply chain issues. They can't even get drapes on some of the systems right now in some of the platforms. So you've got an infrastructure support, and you've got a thin layer of trust left when it comes to robotics with Medtronic right now. A very, very, very thin layer. And I don't know how much patience they're going to have moving forward on the massive investment and the gaps in the current Hugo system, because you've gone, since current leadership there, you've lost $80 billion in market cap, and I don't see it turning around. And you're talking about a massive investment back into getting into digital surgery. So I'm going to put Medtronic on the sidelines right now in that area. I think Stryker is going to surprise a lot of people on a decision they make over the next 12 to 18 months on entering the market. I think they're suspiciously quiet. I think Steve pointed out something a couple weeks ago where if you go to Stryker's webpage, it looks like a flea market. I mean, they're selling this, they're selling that. There's no focus in there. And I think they're going to have to make a move pretty soon in digital surgery than later. So Kevin's been very quiet. He hasn't said he hasn't gotten in there, but what he has said is he's not going against somebody. J&J still has the best infrastructure of all to deploy a successful surgical robotic platform. That's got to be an acquisition. It's not going to be Ottava. And so whoever they end up acquiring, they've got the best setup, the best financial platform, the best ability to run a lease program, to finance it, to deploy it out of those three. So I think that J&J enters with an acquisition, Stryker enters with an acquisition. Medtronic is going to die on the hill with Hugo. They're losing trust in every single hospital system. So push them out. I think your new entrants are going to be J&J and Stryker with acquisitions within the next 24 months.
Yeah, I had Andy Pierce, actually his Stryker Talks podcast will be going out this morning, and I asked him about soft tissue robotics, and he didn't say anything, but he didn't not say anything out. If they wanted to quash it and say we're not doing that, they would quash it and say we're not doing that. That wasn't the statement that was made. It was very left very much open ended. So folks can check out the Stryker Talks podcast. Steve, continue the train of thought that Joe's got going.
Yeah, I think Joe's got a strong train of thought there. I'm going to go even more tactical though, and talk about what's going to be happening in the next coming months, probably in the competitive environment, especially the US, because that's where a lot of people are focused and looking. I think Medtronic is going to get a clearance. They're going to get a single, something like a urology, just with urology clearance. I think they'll go to 10, 12 of their very friendly big hospitals where, they're already well embedded, and they'll get the Hugo in there. And then, just like they've had in Europe, they'll have a dawning reality of the performance of the system, the acceptance of the system. And I think what you'll see over the next 12 months for them is a very focused and targeted release into the US, because they won't want to cause brand damage if they feel it's not accepted in the US. So I think that would be the smart thing for them to do. People have done very unsmart things in this industry. I think J&J, they've got the big promise they're going to get the IDE going in the second half of this year. I struggle to see that, just knowing how hard it is to get an IDE going, even when you've got the clearance by the FDA to start your IDE. Dropping it down into the very next day after you get the clearance by the FDA, that's a challenge. There's a lot you've got to do between clearance and doing it. So what I would say is that I think that they will miss the deadline for the IDE this year in terms of getting the first. They might get the submission in, they might get the clearance, but the first cases will be best case Q1 2025. And then they will just have, just as Medtronic did, a very long recruitment process, way longer than they think. And it's going to just keep pushing everything out. And in the meantime, they're going to be hemorrhaging on endomechanicals as Intuitive takes more stapling, more energy. So I think it's in the competitive side for me, I think the two to watch is Medtronic and J&J as they scramble to try and stem the hemorrhage.
All right, interesting stuff. Real quick to wrap up this conversation, we could talk for another hour. One thing I wanted to focus on with some of the interesting, I think, tech stories. Telesurgery, that's something that SRS, a lot of the companies, I think particularly OUS, were focused on. Felt very real, a lot realer than I thought it would be. Joe, what's your take on where telesurgery will be going? We had obviously Space Mirror earlier this year up in the space station being operated remotely, but how do you see this area developing? And then Steve, you can follow up.
I think telesurgery's got a market to it. I think there are bigger problems right now to solve on the surgical robotic side of things. But listen, I like the thesis on stroke. I like the thesis on the neuro side of things, where time is brain, and it's really important. The platforms out there right now, like Proximie, have been in a fight long enough and offer great value. I think you're going to start to see those sort of white labeled into all the systems, and then we'll see what the real use factor is on that broadly in surgical robotics. But I think it's here. I just don't know how massive it is. I just think it becomes another feature set on most robots sooner than later.
Steve?
Yeah, agree with Joe. The big use case will be in stroke and distance stroke management. I think that's going to be, and we can maybe do a whole nother talk on that some other time. But in the meantime, the Chinese have definitely got the lead on it in terms of what we saw at SRS for sure. They're actually doing a lot of cases, and also Hinatori is doing quite a lot of cases in Japan. It's interesting. I don't know what the real use case is. Maybe in China, India, Japan, they've got some use cases for it, but it's not going to be a regular day-to-day occurrence. And Joe rightly mentions, I think we've got all the fish to fry at the minute, i.e., for some people, just get your robot out. That would be a good start before you start trying to link up robots you don't have. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done. It's going to be a table stake of the future. Same with digital ecosystems. These are all going to be table stakes. If you don't have it on the system, people are going to say, why not? But I don't think it's going to be a major driver of the market. But it's interesting technology. It is real, and you can do it.
Fantastic. And let's talk a little bit about endovascular robots, Steve, if you want to kind of just talk about that new breed of a robot coming. And I think we hit upon a little bit earlier on, but there's a lot of them coming.
Yeah, I think that this is again a very good area in the endovascular, neurovascular space. Is going to be a really interesting. There's a lot of companies in stealth, but there's even more companies in stealth than I thought 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of companies now coming out of stealth. There's a lot of companies being seen, and very different approaches to how people are doing it, from adding more big iron in the room to not adding big iron in the room. There's different ways that they're looking at it. I think that the neurovascular and the structural heart robots are
Mhm.
going to be quite two of the interesting segments in the near future.
Joe, are these robots, these endovascular robots?
I think we'll call them in that category right now, but look for a sort of revised category name into these. And what you'll see, what'll be really interesting about these is where, when we think about robotics today, we primarily think about therapeutic. You're going to see a lot more diagnostic robotics in the endovascular space, where you can get an imaging capability in an area that you might not have been before, and at the same time be therapeutic. So you can think about Monarch or something like that, right? Where we can go in, we can diagnose, and if we need to, treat immediately. Low cost point, way more acquirers. So I think that outstrips revenue worldwide within 5 to 6 years over soft tissue, in my opinion, that category.
All right, and final area, we don't talk much about hard tissue. It's been an area that Mako has dominated, but Velis got an approval earlier this year. Think Surgical, which is the tiny handheld robot, is now partnering with Zimmer Biomet. I don't know how closely you folks track this area, but Steve, do you see any kind of movement in this space? Any innovation coming to the hard tissue field?
Yeah. So again, I think Velis has already done over 60,000 cases, just to give you an idea of, you know, the speed that they go, because there's a lot of ortho cases done. And when it's linked into your implant, you kind of got a ready audience. And again, I don't know how many they're selling versus how many they're placing. But you would imagine that if you want to keep all your implant business, you know, placing a robot is not a bad way to lock people into your ecosystem. And I think what I'm seeing now is that a lot of these systems are you're getting the same system that can do multiple applications. So knee arthroplasty, and then you go into hip, or you go into spine, or you go into different areas. And you're seeing that with Mako. You're seeing that with Velis. And I think Velis is already looking at 2 or 3 new procedures ahead. They talked about it a little bit at SRS. So that's where I see it going, is that you're going to have one platform that can become a multi-tool in different procedures, because there's no room left, especially in ASCs, to have 15 robots stacked up in the corridor. So that's the way they're all going to have to go, I think.
Yeah, the quandary in that space is that's an incredibly different revenue model.
Yep.
It's driven by the implant, not by the robot. And the implant technology hasn't changed much. You got people like Canary Medical with Bill Hunter over there, who's now putting, you know, smart implants into these hard tissue sort of platforms. I think he's working with Yvonne over at Zimmer in that area. I think you're going to see Gen 2 in spine. I don't think you're going to see a big change in knee or hip on the robotic side. I think you're going to see a much more affordable, lower cost, higher performing robot in the spinal space if we're going to look at that hard tissue before anything else. And I would say I'm aware of 2 or 3 platforms right now that in the next 18 to 24 months are going to be very disruptive to that category. And it's interesting because they'll be implant agnostic. So you've got such a fragmented spinal space. If you go to, you know, NASS, the spine show, there's 50 different companies selling 100 different SKUs on a, you know, piece of hardware that goes into the spine, but very few of them have robots. So that sets up for a really interesting market for a high-performing, lower-cost robot to then become a deployment and an empower of those implants. So that's where I think you're going to see most in the hard tissue side.
All right. Well, just quickly, closing comments. Hopefully we'll have a conversation again in 6 months and kind of retrack what happened from July to December. But Steve, anything you're anticipating? I mean, anything you want to bring up? We haven't talked about dental. I know you know the dental space. There's a lot of other areas of interest for robotics, but a few closing thoughts for you.
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of what we haven't seen today, like Histosonics and Lupin Dental and some of the others, which are kind of like parallel robots that don't exactly hit into the surgery side of things directly. I think you're going to see a lot of noise coming up about those in the next 6 months. I think from the surgical robotics side, it's going to be interesting to see what the run rate is for Da Vinci 5 coming out at the end of 2024. That's going to be a big indicator of what happens. Do Medtronic get their clearance this year or not? do J&J get their IDE through or not? These are going to be big landmark things that are going to decide the fate of this this sector in the next 5 years. So I think it's going to be an exciting end to this year.
Great. Final word to you, Joe Mullings.
I'm with Steve. I like the incisionless surgery that's not been discussed enough yet with Histosonics and Cytec, companies like that. So I don't know why we would not include them in a robot, because it's imaging, navigation, only it's not an incision, but there's still everything on a computer and AI and digital between the surgeon, the patient. So again, we come down new category. So incisionless surgery, I think, is going to make its way into this category as well.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I learned so much from these conversations. I can't wait to do it again. Gentlemen, thanks for sharing your insights and knowledge.
Tom, thanks as always for being a great host for us. And Steve, my friend, always good to chop it up with you.
Thank you very much, guys. Great to always great to bounce this around.
Yeah. I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.